I always say that being a good therapist is as much an art as it is a science because you can teach someone all about the field. You can tell them how to use the tools and the techniques we have, but if you don't have a talent to be a therapist, you probably won't be a good one. I think a good analogy here is basketball. We all can go on the court, we can throw the ball into the hoop. We might even have a game of it. But that doesn't make us good at it just because we engage in the process of playing basketball. Practicing therapy, I think, is a lot like that. It takes practice, yes, but if you don't already have some talent for it, you're not going to become a pro at it. Now, we're finally beginning the real work on learning about assessment. Remember when I said that assessment is what really sets us apart from other professionals in the mental health field? Well, that's only partially true. The clinical interview is a fundamental part of assessment, but it's important to recognize that all mental health professionals, whether they're clinical psychologists or not, conduct clinical interviews. What distinguishes clinical psychology is our expertise in other forms of assessment beyond the clinical interview. So, regardless of whether you want to become a clinical psychologist or not, honing your clinical interview skills is essential. Assessment always begins with the clinical interview, and every assessment should begin with a strong clinical interview because this is what lays the foundation for effective evaluation and treatment. Now, related to your chapter on clinical interviews, your book does a really good job of focusing us on the important key skills and behaviors of a clinician who are conducting clinical interviews. It differentiates between different kinds of clinical interviews, describes the components of them. It discusses whether to take notes in front of a client or not, what to remember about informed consent, other general things about the interview process. But I want to share with you today 5 truths that maybe you might not fully appreciate just from reading about the clinical interview in your textbook. Okay? Okay. So, number 1, remember that the clinical interview is a first impression. The clinical interview is more than just gathering facts. It's about rapport building. If done stiffly or coldly, that's wrong. It's wrong because the client may feel like they're being interrogated rather than heard. And this can lead to discomfort or a reluctance to share information, to open up. I do have a personal example of this when I was in grad school. A classmate of mine had a client come into the psychology clinic. The client shared a personal story about losing a loved one. But instead of the clinician acknowledging their emotions, she just moved straight into the next question on the list. She had a clipboard in front of her with a list of questions, and she wanted to make sure she got through those questions. Now, as I was watching through the one-way mirror, I think this probably made the client feel dismissed and probably didn't make a great first impression either, right? No. But the clinical interview, I want you to remember, is not only about that. It's not only about establishing rapport. It's also about reading between the lines. Clients often don't reveal key information in their answers from your direct questions. They might drop hints or speak indirectly about what's really troubling them. And if a clinician doesn't follow up or explore further, important diagnostic clues can be overlooked. I can give you an example of this too. Let's say a client says, I don't really sleep much these days. And instead of the clinician exploring the underlying reasons for that, they just kind of move on to their next question. Well, maybe their lack of sleep is due to depression or anxiety or some trauma. Or maybe it's due to the medication they're taking. It could be due to something they're having in their diet. So my point is, not exploring further at that very moment would be a missed opportunity for deeper insights. Don't you think? Now, the clinical interview is also about setting the foundation for effective therapeutic relationships. If you have a rigid approach, it can feel very impersonal. It makes the client hesitate to share more. If your questions seem out of sync with the client's concerns, they can disengage with you or give short, unhelpful answers to you. I remember watching a clinical interview of a fellow classmate of mine in grad school. The client was struggling with social anxiety. She started explaining about a recent panic attack. Now, the clinician did listen at first, but I think because they might have been a little short on time, she just kind of cut her off and started asking her about her childhood history, that, question on her checklist. But the question was unrelated to the panic attack or the social anxiety. And as I observed through the one-way mirror after that, I noticed that the client started to withdraw. And I assume probably felt unheard by the clinician. Again, this is not a great first impression. Consider too that some structured questions that you might have in front of you on your list in the clinical interview assume clients know how to articulate their thoughts clearly. So if a clinician doesn't adjust their approach, using clarifying questions or rewording things, for example, the responses might not reflect the client's true experiences. A powerful example of the difficulty people can have in expressing themselves can be seen when you are talking to someone with dementia. I experienced this with my mother-in-law who suffers from Alzheimer's. When I ask her a question, I can see her struggling to find the right words. But she gets so frustrated with herself because she can't explain herself. You can see that she's feeling something, she's thinking something, but she can't quite express it to me. She can't express it to me in a way that I can appreciate it anyway. So then she eventually just gives up and says, I don't know. The same thing sometimes happens with clients in the office. If you ask a question and your client looks confused or unsure and you don't explore that, you're probably missing an opportunity to clarify what that means in real life terms for them. And your client, they're going to pick up on that. So I want you to think about the last time that you met someone who made you feel instantly comfortable. What did they say? How did they interact with you? What did they do to make such a good first impression on you? What I want you to do is to try to incorporate some of those things when you have to do clinical interviews. So remember, first impressions matter, okay? That's number one. Number two is that I like to say that the clinical interview is a lot like jazz music. Yes, it's structured, but it also has a lot of improvisation. Many textbooks, including the one that we're using, outline what a structured, semi-structured, and unstructured format is. But in real life, all clinical interviews, even structured ones, require adaptability. That's why I like to compare it to jazz. There is a framework, but the clinician must respond fluidly to what the client brings in that moment. Okay, that's number two. Number three, there's power in the unspoken. Clinical interviews aren't just about what is said or spoken to you. Sometimes what isn't said can be just as telling as what is. So if someone gives you a one-word answer and avoids eye contact, for example, what does that tell you? What about someone who talks in circles but avoids a key topic? No, they didn't answer your question from your checklist outright the way you expected them to or wanted them to. But if you pay attention to their nonverbals, what's not said, that can tell you a lot too. This draws attention to the need of observational skills. Your observational skills as a clinician beyond the checklist of questions. So remember, observational skills are really important. Okay? Okay, number 4, remember that good interviews can still lead to misdiagnoses. I don't want you to ever assume that a well-conducted interview will always lead to an accurate diagnosis or that a clinician will get all the key pieces of information from it. Sometimes a clinician can miss a vital piece of information, things like cultural differences, unconscious bias, or malingering even. Here's a really good, kind of embarrassing personal example that I can give you about missing vital information. My very first disability determination was conducted with my clinical supervisor at the time. We interviewed a veteran who was applying for disability benefits because he claimed severe PTSD from combat. He described frequent nightmares, flashbacks, hypervigilance. His answers in the structured clinical interview perfectly matched PTSD criteria. You know, we got done with the interview and my supervisor asked me to write the report, and then we would confer together in our treatment team meeting. I learned later in our treatment team meeting that he was fabricating symptoms for financial gain. This is called malingering. But because I was so new, I missed some key nonverbal kinds of things. I missed some malingering cues. I missed that he lacked emotional distress when recounting his traumatic events, for example. I missed that he delivered details in a rehearsed and almost robotic way. I missed that he exaggerated symptoms that were uncommon for PTSD, like he claimed a total amnesia for months at a time. And I missed that his reported symptoms sometimes changed depending on who was asking the question, me or my supervisor. So I learned a lot from that supervisor and that treatment team meeting. I soaked up all I could from my supervisor because her skills were so good. You learn from seasoned professionals and treatment teams and are able to better your skills. Now, the last thing I want to say about good interviews is that I want you to remember that a rigid script can't account for things like cultural differences in communication styles. It can't account for mental health stigma that the client might experience or believe themselves. It can't account for even language nuances. But a skilled interviewer adapts to these factors, and they can ensure that the client feels understood rather than judged. I have an example of what I'm talking about here too. If you ask in a clinical interview about hallucinations, for example, and you don't consider cultural and religious beliefs that that client has, it could lead to a misinterpretation of spiritual experiences as psychosis. And remember, as I told you before, labels stick. All right, so that's that. My last truth is, number 5, be prepared for the most uncomfortable question you'll have to ask. One of the hardest things to discuss in an interview revolves around difficult subjects. So, what do you think would be the hardest questions for you to ask as a future clinician? I'm talking here about questions you might have to explore around maybe things like suicidal ideation or trauma. Those things come to mind for me. But my question is, how do you prepare yourself for that moment, for those questions that scare you? That's number 5. Okay. I hope these 5 things I've shared with you today help you think beyond the basics that are going to be presented in your textbook to you. I hope instead that it encourages you to engage clinical interviews not just as important questions, but with the human and the dynamic aspects of them, okay? You probably see now how clinical interviewing is probably harder than it sounds. It is. But with talent, it's a skill you can master. So let's dig into clinical interviews.